So I'm very happy to be joined today by Tom Cheesewright, who is here for the latest of our Analytica influencer interview series. Tom is an applied futurist with a really wide-ranging background across a lot of really interesting campaigns. I'm really excited to be joined by him today. So Tom, thanks very much for joining. I wanted to start actually with a quick summary. Maybe if you could just kind of tell the folks at home who you are and kind of what you spend your days on.
Yeah, so I'm an applied futurist. What that means is I work with organizations to really try and answer three questions. First of all, what does our future look like? And I range into the distant future, so 25, 30 years, but actually spend a lot of my time looking at the next 2 to 5, the near horizon. The second question we work on is how do you tell that story? It's no good having a vision of the future if you can't share it with the people that matter. So I do a lot of work around storytelling, whether that's written content, joint media interviews, video work, whatever it may be, and a lot of speaking as well, actually speaking at conferences, either alongside clients or to clients. And then the third question is, what do we do about it? And the reason I call myself an applied futurist is we get into the challenge of how do you solve the problems that this vision of the future throws up, as well as just sort of painting this picture of doom and gloom or excitement. Try and get a bit of both in. And alongside all that, I write books as well. So I've written 2 books now, High Frequency Change last year, which was shortlisted for the Business Book of the Year Award, and Future Proof Your Business, which comes out in the next few days, which is one of the FT's recommended business books for July.
Cool. Yeah, it's an ambitious topic, kind of future proofing, I guess. You know, do you feel like you've seen a big change maybe in the last, even in the last few months? Like, are people, I don't know whether it's kind of a bit gauche to sort of say it's good for the book, that more people are maybe going to be thinking about the future. Do you think it's been a case of accelerating the trends, or do you think there's kind of maybe it's been the nudge that everyone needed to start thinking about some of it properly?
Very much that, Jack. I think the whole COVID pandemic has accelerated a lot of trends, not least of which is this shift in philosophy that I'm seeing a lot of business leaders particularly go through, which is, and it's not that it wasn't happening before the pandemic, but it's certainly sort of, turned a lens on some of the changes they need to make for many. And it's this philosophical shift is fundamental. It's that shift from, okay, my job as a leader is to extract the maximum efficiency and optimization for the organization that I've joined. So, how do we do better tomorrow what we did yesterday? How do we do it with greater profit, greater growth, whatever that may be? And over the typical course of a 5-year tenure for a CEO, they might make that their expectation. Over 5 years, I'm going to optimize, I'm going to grow some bits, shrink others, extract maximum value from what we have. And now they're coming in and saying, do you know what? I don't think there's a good chance that I can get through 5 years without some fundamental disruption to what we do. And if you didn't know that was a possibility before, then the pandemic has absolutely demonstrated how rapidly your world can be turned upside down. And so you see more and more leaders come in and go, actually, it's my job to make this business resilient. It's my job to make this business adaptable and innovative and flexible so that, maybe I don't extract the maximum value in the next 5 years, but I create a platform for it still to be successful in 20. And that's the really big shift I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess even just something like, food chain in the first weeks when lockdown happened, you kind of saw we've got all of this just-in-time delivery and we've made everything so efficient, and we suddenly found out it's not terribly resilient to kind of, I don't know, the 30% of meals people were having out suddenly disappearing, and suddenly the kind of supply chain collapses. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what's an example of someone who kind of maybe before this happened, you think was already thinking about that? Are there businesses that you think were doing a good job of that before, or do you think it's kind of really, it's only now that people are openly talking about it properly?
No, and there's lots of different approaches. So I see lots of organizations taking different approaches to this challenge. All roughly allied around one of the 3 different things I talk about in the book. I talk about, how do you accelerate decision making? I talk about how do you build an agile structure in your organization, and I talk about how you look at the future as well and think about tomorrow. And so, you see organizations like members of the Shared Services Forum looking at their organizations and saying, how do I break this big monolith down into a box of Lego bricks that can be dynamically reassembled to meet new challenges. You meet organizations like, the CEO of HSBC, who's quoted in the book, who told me that he's trying to push power down through the organization so that decisions can be made by many more people much closer to the customer, much closer to the market. And that's really important. And you see organizations like BMW, I work with, who changed their entire leadership development program to teach people what they call ambidextrous leadership, where on the one hand, BMW's built its name, built its brand by just doing everything better the following year than it did before, this continuous process optimization. But on the other hand, they recognize now they have to be really innovative. And so they're teaching all of the leaders and managers in the organization the skills of innovation and iteration, and how to have optimization on the one hand, but innovation on the other. So yes, we're seeing quite a few examples before the crisis hit, but as you say, it's really brought it to people's attention, and hence why we brought the launch of the book forward, and why it's why I think it's been so it's really caught people's attention so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting thinking about how you get under the skin of an organization. It's interesting, you're talking a lot about kind of developing the people is actually seems to be the kind of the key thing. Is almost the key factor, whether it's BMW or kind of HSBC. Was there a particular, is that a sort of specialism you think you've ended up developing for a particular reason? I guess what I'm almost asking is kind of how did you get into that as a for the folks at home, how does one become a futurist? Is there a special roadmap? I'm guessing the answer is probably not, but
there really isn't. I mean, I have a background really as a technologist. I have a degree in mechatronic engineering. I still tend to approach everything with kind of an engineering mindset, which is why when I came at this problem first, it was very much a tools problem. Like, what are the tools for looking at the future? Are they fit for purpose in this age of uncertainty? Do I need to build new ones? And I came to the conclusion I did, which led me to a very sort of structural approach to organizations. So having come from this sort of technology background, my last business was a tech startup. You immediately sort of start to see technological solutions and everything, and technology driving a lot of change. But then you really get, I got fascinated by the mechanics of organizations and how they're structured and how they're built and how their processes are set up. And that's led me now where I'm starting to talk more and more about the people. I've gone from sort of technology to process to people, and particularly around sort of the skills aspects of this. I spend a lot of time talking to organizations like the big banks about what the skills aspects are of this transformation they're going to go through in the next 20 years, where in the past what they needed was loads of people with great customer facing skills who could be on the phone or could be in a branch, whereas actually increasingly what they need is people who can build customer facing technology, and how are they going to translate those rooms full of call center operatives and branches full of bank clerks into people who can operate in a mixed reality environment, or who can write the code that's going to underpin their digital interfaces, or imagine what might be next. It's my background is technology. My approach has been very much structural engineering, but increasingly find myself talking about people and skills and emotion as well. I've always been fascinated by where these big sort of macro trends that touch us all intersect with society. I find myself doing a lot of sort of things around retail now and media, and what the likely transformations in those of buying behaviors are as we go through the sort of coming changes, and as our demographics change as they are so radically at the moment.
Yeah, it's been interesting seeing sort of, if you follow the progress of the tech industry, for example, over the last 10 years, I think it's interesting to sort of note we did start off quite utopian and quite excited about the possibilities of tech. And now actually it's, you look at the kind of the drama around the big four CEOs going to Congress to testify. And actually it's a very human drama around, what's Bezos like, what's Zuckerberg like, and how will the decisions that they make impact it. So I think that's always the funny thing about tech. I've always thought it is ultimately about the people. Well, I haven't always thought that. I've come to think that. Rather than pretending I always knew. But it's interesting how those two things kind of interact. So we're talking about the sort of the human element internally, but you touched on it with the banking example there. Do you think kind of retail's an interesting example of that, where the way that the tech interacts with people external to the organization is even more important, because those people they don't have the context of an organization in the same way, someone who works there knows the systems. Do you think, is there a sort of even bigger shift coming there in terms of how people, how services get delivered? Because you mentioned demographics. Actually, the population is in a lot of European countries is getting older. Do you think is there do you think there's a difficulty coming there in terms of how organizations adapt to be able to serve actually an older customer base? Or do you think, I don't know, maybe you've gotten across the data and people are getting more tech savvy overall over time? Or do you think the pace of change actually is something businesses are going to have to reckon with?
No, I mean, technology is kind of our only hope in some ways. So, I mean, the demographic crisis, the latest data out of the University of Washington shows that the demographic crisis is happening faster than we thought. And when I say crisis, let's put this in context. It's generally a good news story. It's a combination of us living longer and having better birth control and better education and more, career opportunities for women. So this is basically a really good news story. The problem
also
is
less likely to die in an industrial accident,
right,
that kind of thing. All health and safety things like that have actually, you're less likely to have a steel girder.
Violent crime, all of those things down. So it's a really good news story, but the transformation is happening incredibly quickly. So instead of population topping out by the end of this century as we expected at about 11 billion, it looks likely it's going to top out in the middle of the century at 9.5 billion, which means that the shift from a young population to an old population is happening really, really fast. And, you look at parts of the UK where there'll be 1-to-1 ratios of people of retirement age to working age within 20 years, if not worse. Places like Spain and Italy where populations are going to halve by the end of the century.
Or ask Japan how the 90s were for their economy.
Right. So I mean, if we're going to, there's going to be lots of structural things we have to do, lots of political things we have to do, increase the retirement age. We have to work on public health initiatives to keep people fit and healthy and out of the health system longer. Spending on the NHS has overtaken like all of the categories, dramatically, because we do lots of acute care and very little preventative work in terms of our investment spread. So you've got to change that, but actually you've got to really start to look at technology that can augment us later in life and keep us independent and keep us capable. And that's everything from technologies that are going to analyze our health, give us prompts, point us in the right direction in terms of diet and nutrition and exercise, through to technologies that absolutely will make the care of people cheaper. And this gets really controversial because people don't like the idea of robots in a care context. I've been looking for a few years now about technologies that can monitor you overnight and mean that a person doesn't have to come and knock on the door every couple of hours to make sure you're still breathing. That can keep an eye on your temperature, your mobility, your heart rate, your breathing rate, your encephalograms, all sorts of things. Look at your body in much greater depth, but in many ways in a less invasive way than somebody actually knocking on the door and coming in your room. So there's a huge adaptation to go. In terms of just come back to your question about in terms of the user interface and whether that needs to change. No, the people who are getting older are generally tech savvy now. You look at my parents who are in their early 70s. They were working in a time when they were hooking up their mobile phone to their laptop to download their email, 25 years ago. So for most people in that age group now, this technology is kind of familiar.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of easy. The tech has definitely moved fast, but I don't think it's not a particularly new thing. Even someone my dad's age has basically always had a computer on his desk, so it's kind of
and you look at where the computing the enhanced computing power is going. Like, so we know that about Moore's law. We know that double the economic. We double the processing power per pound we get every couple of years. But actually, a lot of that processing power goes into making the user interface easier to use. It goes into powering things like voice assistants. It goes into powering things like multi-touch interfaces. So actually, even though the technology gets more powerful, in many ways, the usability has accelerated faster than the technology.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? So I've been following the kind of progress of the EV that you're building a little bit on Twitter. I kind of wanted to ask about that. Do you think it have kind of do you think you always just had that interest and that's what's driven you into this career, or do you still find that there are things that you sort of, I don't know, maybe it was working at BMW that made you think, oh, I want to go do this? Is it kind of a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. I mean, yeah, I've been obsessed with technology and including cars and stuff from a very young age. And, I grew up in the age of Star Wars. My mum bought me the Usborne Book of the Future in 1981, which I've still got a very tattered edition of just over there, my original edition, which has got, electric cars and stuff in. And I tinkered with cars as a teenager, and then, got most of the way through building a kit car a few years ago before a house move meant it had to go. So this was kind of a natural project for me. And once I started tinkering around the edges of the open source electric vehicle movement, and this is incredible. I mean, this is a real artifact of the 21st century. A global bunch of electronics engineers getting together and going, do you know what? We could build an electric vehicle if we all contribute a bit. And reverse engineering bits from Toyota and Lexus and Tesla. Once I sort of understood that, and then my eldest daughter got into cars as well and said, can we build a car? I was like, yep, let's do it. And so, yeah, we're probably, with a following wind in the next 4 weeks, we might actually have something that's notionally drivable, starting with a BMW Z3 and then retrofitting a load of components from Mitsubishi and Toyota and stuff bought off eBay. And then topping it all with a layer of open source code. We might have something drivable within 4 weeks.
Wow. How long is that from start to finish?
Probably 3 months all in. Okay. So probably less, actually. I mean, there was a lot of dreaming at the start until I may have, then sort of prompt from my daughter convinced me to buy a motor, and that just sort of started the investment waterfall where I went on and bought a car, an inverter, all the various things to make it work. But yeah, it's probably about 3 months all in to go to. It'll take some time after that, a lot of tuning and fettling and things like that. But to actually build something that's notionally drivable, maybe 3 months.
Yeah, you've got something that's at least the dictionary definition of the car, even if it's a nightmare to drive.
It's a lockdown project.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was going to say, it's kind of, in the absence of being able to go anywhere and see anyone, that's probably something quite nice to work with your hands and lose yourself in it. Seeing all the DIY projects and the gardening everyone's doing, I guess it's something to do with your hands to kind of stop yourself going mad. So I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on, some of the other people maybe who've kind of influenced you, or people whose kind of thinking has really influenced you. I always think whenever I talk to people, there's kind of journalists and analysts and commentators I would recommend for like a follow on Twitter, or people whose book to go read. Who do you think are your kind of top influences?
That's a really good question. I'm lucky enough to sort of have a fairly interesting network of people. So on politics, I defer to Rob Ford at the University of Manchester, who I get to go to the pub with and grill over a pint, which is very useful. He's got a new book coming out soon called Brexitland. In terms of sort of business thinking, I've sort of consumed a lot of the classics. Someone brought me back to Crossing the Chasm the other day, which remains a really sort of important and interesting book. But the biggest answer is that because I jump from domain to domain, so I've built a toolkit that can be applied to any sector. I find myself jumping into the experts in any particular domain, so 1 week after the next. So, a few weeks ago, or a few months ago now, Auto Trader come to me and commissioned a project on the future of the car. That means going and devouring loads of content about the car and electric vehicles and speaking to academics about, autonomous vehicles and doing all those things. And you're just absorbing that information for maybe 6 weeks. But then, another project will come along, and I've just had a commission to do a piece on the future of healthcare, for example. And all of a sudden, I'm diving into white papers from around the world from, medical specialists and public health policy specialists, and again, academic papers, trying to get my head around how all this applies. And there's still a common set of understanding in terms of trends, in terms of human behavior and everything else that comes through this. But I really find myself diving into lots of different pools of information rather than sort of relying on on one core set of information. I could probably point to Benedict Evans's newsletter, actually, which remains a very good source of information and sort of point us to interesting things going on in Silicon Valley and around the world in technology. But it really is that huge diversity of sources that keeps this job really interesting.
Okay, that kind of takes me quite neatly on, I guess, to the next question, which is almost, it sounds like if an organization is interested in working with you, then really the brief would almost be, would you say it's like we have either a story, a kind of complex story we want to tell, or a complex problem we want to solve?
So it usually starts with, my output ranges from internal to external. So sometimes a company will ring me up and say, look, as one of the big tech giants did last year, we want to develop our processes for how we look at the future. Will you come and teach us how you work? Or will you come and train our leaders or something like that? Or will you come and give a provocation to get us thinking differently? And so I'll go and do a talk for the corporate conference, or go and work with some of the board, or whoever it may be, to try and shape their thinking. And then there's the external projects where somebody come to me and say, we think we'd really like to spend the next 6-9 months talking about the future of, or frankly, just the next 2 weeks, talking about the future of something. And that'll be, help us. We want to understand the future of retail, like Salesforce did, or we want to understand the future of banking, with HSBC, or whoever it may be. Can you run your process, do your analysis for us on what the future of this space looks like? And then we'll build a report out of it, and we'll build an external campaign around that, around our view on the future of X, Y, or Z. And that takes many different forms. Sometimes it's an 8,000-word white paper, a launch event, a series of follow-on blog posts and mini white papers, some joint speaking gigs, some media interviews, and that might take 18 months. Sometimes it's we'd really like your contribution to our report and a quote for our press release, and it takes 2 weeks. It really varies, but it really starts generally with that question: is what does the future look like, or how do we look at the future? And increasingly, a lot of my internal work is about how do we look at the future and how do we prepare for it, whereas my external facing work is answering what is the future of X, where X can be just about anything in the world. Yeah,
I was kind of stuck on that phrase, almost come in and provoke people. I thought that's quite an interesting, kind of an interesting way of thinking. Like, it kind of sounds like you've been listening to me talking politics at company events, but what would be an example of that if you're sort of wanting to get people to think differently? Do you think it's just that naturally in an organization people get set in ways of thinking? I think I probably all catch ourselves. Anyone who works in an organization of more than one person, probably you catch yourself in patterns or dynamics. Maybe even if lots of people have probably spent a lot of time with a roommate or a partner in lockdown, and you probably realize you get dynamics in the way that you behave. Do you think is it just snapping people out of that, you think?
Yeah. The number of people who can remain objective and keep the blinkers off while inside a particular industry or organization for any length of time is really, really small. I don't think I could do it. It's why it's important to have outsiders sometimes to come in and give you diverse perspectives. I think the number of times I go into an organization and I hear, this industry is different, or that won't work here, or our customers don't want that. Because you build up a sense of expertise, and particularly once you get to a sort of leadership tier, you've probably been in that industry 15, 20 years, it. And part of my job as in sort of provocation is to help people understand how much they don't know, to show them, how connected their industry is to other industries that could dramatically change their world overnight, whether that's adjacent industries, whether that's new market entrants, whether that's new geographies starting to compete in their space, whether that's new technologies that could turn their industry upside down. And it's you have that advantage as any consultant does as an outsider to look at things afresh. And even sometimes you feel like what you're saying is quite trite, and yet everybody in the room is absolutely scandalized. Until they realize that actually, that sooner or later they realize you might be right. There's a great example of that. I did a talk in the retail industry years ago about drones and the possibilities of drone delivery. And And one of the guys in the audience just thought I was an absolute, I was talking absolute nonsense, and said so, and then called me up 18 months later to ask him to go and speak at his conference, because within the following 18 months we'd had all these really serious announcements about flying drones, rolling drones, and how people were trying to turn this into a practical option for retail delivery. And so you most people in a room, you're generally starting with quite a difficult position, is that they're the experts and you're not, you're the outsider. And it's become, an art form is overselling it, but you learn the discipline of absorbing an industry quickly, understanding what's important, and then telling people. What you tend to end up doing is telling people three things. You tell them 30% of what you tell them is enough to is things they already know, which gives you credibility. About a third of things you tell people is things they know but they've probably forgotten or just hadn't quite latched onto yet, which starts to get them their juices going. And then about a third of the stuff you tell them is something completely new, like things that they just hadn't even considered. So, I went and spoke to the Super Yacht Design Symposium in Kitzbühel, and,
in a landlocked country.
Exactly. It's hilarious. All these yacht heads go there and go skiing. As you can imagine, it's quite a wealthy crowd.
I mean, Switzerland's won the America's Cup, actually, which is a sailing trophy. So there we go.
There you go. You can't rule out all the landlocked countries. And I talked to them about, I talked about the things they understood about, range issues and, how much space inside the hull is given over to, fuel tanks and everything else, and how that takes space away from the fun stuff. And then, went and took my interviews with the academics at the University of Manchester, the National Graphene Institute, about what's possible. And, painted this picture of what you could do to a super yacht if you implemented graphene, solar panels, and next generation batteries. And, all of a sudden you get this, this completely different picture of what's possible. And so I talked to them about issues they understood, but then talked to them about and then took them into this world that was completely impossible. And to be fair, I really went over the top there, because I talked to them about how you could actually sail your yacht out to a space elevator in the middle of the sea, which, if we build space elevators, is likely to where there be, and continue your cruise all the way up into space. But you've got to give them that. You've got to give them that credibility, establishing stuff they know, the stuff they hadn't quite thought about, or a different twist on the things they already understood, and then something completely new as well.
Yeah, I guess, much as when you sort of get inside the organization, there's a toolkit. Even it's kind of learning to condense it down is probably the tricky thing, isn't it? Do you think would you say there's like a common thread in the sort of projects that really, they hit your inbox and you think, yes, definitely? Is there a particular, it's probably not going to be an absolute rule. There's probably got to be like an excitement factor, but do you think there's something that they all have in common, and a type of value to you that you always look for in the projects that you accept?
I mean, I think there's it's always exciting to work with a brand you have some passion for, or a product you have some passion for, or some affinity for. I'm obviously interested in technology and cars, so that's always been really good fun. I'm a big foodie, so any sort of projects on the future of food have always been really excited. But what's really surprised me is just how excited I can get about unexpected things. Finance, in terms of accounting, has been a big one. I've spent quite a lot of time working with a variety of organisations on that over the last few years. I found myself getting really passionate about the Office of Finance and what it could be and its transformation and all those things. And that was. I guess it's highlighted something about me, which is and this job, that the thing I love most is learning. So if there was an opportunity to dive into something new and really get deep into the weeds of understanding of a different space, like I'm about to with healthcare now, that really excites me. I did it with the steel industry before Christmas. I recorded presenting some podcasts for ArcelorMittal, the massive global steel producer, and that was fantastic because you with your engineer's head on, you think, I sort of understand steel, I sort of understand how it's made, and then you get to dig into it in great depth and the evolutions going on and the geopolitics and the alternatives and the science and just everything. You start from this sort of position of, okay, you're making mucky stuff that we build things out of, through to this incredibly sort of rich ecosystem that you really have to understand in order to be able to talk about it and query it with any depth.
Yeah, so it's kind of that, it's that thrill you get when you you know, like I sometimes have friends who are like in academia or something like that, and you just start pulling at the thread of kind of what they're researching, and you suddenly just go like, oh my god, like I had no idea about the Nigerian Civil War, and you kind of just want to go away and read about it.
Yeah, it's exactly
for
that.
hours. I should obviously add never during work hours. Even though this is literally for my employer. Oh, there we go. That's the dream, isn't it? Do you think is there anything? Yeah, not to turn excessively negative. Do you think there's like, are there things that put you off, or you know, something that makes you think this project's definitely not going to be for me?
Yeah, I think it's when the client wants too much control of the story. You know, if you want an expert to do an analysis for you, get an expert to do an analysis for you. If you just want to write things that just basically your sort of PR messages in report form, don't, you know, just employ a copywriter. You know, you if you get me involved, it's because you want, you know, my reach, the credibility, the insight, and the analysis, not because you want a copywriter. I'm a very expensive copywriter, and you know, and the worst examples of this are when people are trying to recruit you to spin a message. And so, you know, a good example is, you know, I got contacted by I don't know whether to name them publicly, but I got contacted by an industry which has some ethical issues. And, you know, if they come to me and said, we want to understand what the future of our industry is, that'd be great. But they came to me and were quite explicit about the fact they wanted me to help them spin their ethical issues as a free speech issue, as a freedom of speech issue, which was just, you know, for me was totally unethical and, you know, beyond the pale. And so, you know, anybody who's trying to control the narrative too much, I'll find difficult. But when they're trying to control it to the extent that they're trying to spin something the way it really isn't, that's when I'm just like, I'm out. You know, I'm walking away.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's probably common across a lot of our client bases. It's sort of it's a difficulty with bringing in external people, because I think, you know, so many kind of marketers and PR people are maybe used to having quite tight control of their messaging, and maybe the PR people less, but definitely for marketers, I think that can be quite a difficult. It's a sort of difficult step to take, but then it's really worth it because the content's so much more credible, and it's, you know, it's readable, and it's exciting, and it's kind of something a bit different, really. If people want to get hold of you, what's the best method?
So tomcheesewright.com has everything on it: blog, books, bits of video, all sorts of stuff. And if you can't find me there, I'm at Book of the Future on most social media channels. I am trying to change it to unify everything around Tom Cheesewright. Book of the Future is what my blog used to be called, but trying to sort of navigate the realms of Twitter to get these things done and keep your blue tick is somewhat challenging.
Yeah, you don't want to kind of lose that credibility after years of working for it, and it's the verification process is a little opaque, isn't it? So
just a little.
There is that fear. I don't know if they'll ever tell us quite how it works. But well, I mean, thanks very much to Tom. You guys all heard it. You know, hopefully that's a really exciting kind of insight into all the projects you'd be working on with him, whether it's getting provoked or kind of figuring out what the future of your industry is from someone who's done it a lot. But you all heard how to get in touch with him, so you know, get to it, everyone. And all that's left to say is thanks very much, Tom, for joining me. I've really enjoyed hearing about all the stuff you've been involved in.
Likewise, Jack. No, really appreciate the opportunity.